Jesus' influence endures in spite of those who try to oppose him, often in spite of those who claim to follow him. He's a great historian from Yale, and this is what he wrote. Regardless of what anyone may personally think or believe about him, Jesus of Nazareth has been the dominant figure in the history of Western culture for almost 20 centuries. If it were possible, with some sort of super magnet, to pull up out of that history every scrap of metal bearing at least a trace of his name, how much would be left? Wherever you are on your faith journey, you have to ask yourself, whatever you might think about religion or claims of divinity, just consider him simply as a person who was born, who lived and died. Look honestly and without prejudice at his impact on our world. You have to ask, who was this man? There's the world that Jesus experienced, and the ancient world was a much darker and crueler place than most people know. There is the world that Jesus saw, and the beauty of his vision of what could be transformed the human imagination. And then there is the world that Jesus touched. And most people simply have no idea the impact Jesus has had on our world in almost every sphere of life. Too often, we argue about Christianity instead of marveling at Jesus. And we need to marvel because there are millions of people who don't believe in Jesus right now, but they might become admirers of his, and then maybe followers. Leaders especially need to expand their vision of Jesus' kingdom impact because we are stewards of that movement, a movement that has reshaped history more than any others, and it is not done. And so for the next few moments, we'll just marvel at Jesus. We'll start by naming the obvious. It would be very hard to choose a less likely candidate to change the world. Jesus never held an office, never led an army, never wrote a book, never traveled abroad. His followers were remarkably unimportant. The New Testament itself records them being called unschooled, ordinary men. And yet 2,000 years later, it is impossible to imagine the world without him. To begin with, he gave the world its most influential movement. Imagine a world with no church, no Notre Dame, no St. Paul's Cathedral, no storefront churches in Watts, no house churches in China, no Willow Creek, no gatherings in Africa or Asia or South America, no Peter or Paul or Timothy or Augustine or Aquinas or Mother Teresa or Martin Luther or Joan of Arc or Desmond Tutu. But let's go back to the beginning, to the idea of a church. In the ancient world, there were nations, there were families, there were ethnic groups, there were guilds, there were tribal religions, there were philosophical schools. The church was none of these. Paul says, here, there is no Greek or Jew, circumcised or uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave or free, but Christ is all and in all. There's a place in California called Disneyland. Anybody ever been on a ride called It's a Small World After All? Song will drive you crazy after a while. People of every culture, every nationality, every status together. You think about this. Where, before the church, was there a movement that actively sought to include every single human being, regardless of ethnicity, status, language group, wealth, or gender, to be a single transformational community? Not only had there never been such a community before, there had never been the idea of a community like that. It was his idea. And then it happened. Look at people gathering all together for this event. Look at the disparate people that only Jesus could bring together. Jesse Jackson and Jerry Falwell, Jim Wallace, Jim Dobson and Jimmy Carter, Anne Lamott and Thomas Kincaid, Billy Graham and Billy Sunday and Bill Clinton and Bill Shakespeare, Bono and Bieber and Bev Shea, Galileo, Newton and Kepler, T.S. Eliot, C.S. Lewis, J.R.R. Tolkien, George Washington, Denzel Washington, George Washington Carver, Constantine, Charlemagne, Sarah Palin, Tony Blair, Barack Obama, John Milton, John Wesley, John Calvin, John Bunyan, John the Baptist, John the Disciple, John of the Cross, Pope John the 23rd, and John Maxwell. Who else brings people like that together? And by the way, the 12 steps came directly out of something called the Oxford Group, a community reclaiming the practices of Jesus for transformation. No Jesus, no 12 steps. I'm not saying that apart from Jesus, there never would have been an actionable vision of humankind as family. I'm just saying, as a matter of historical reality, it began with a poverty-stricken, crucified carpenter. Who was this man? Jesus changed how we think about history. Most folks don't know this. In our day, we expect to see progress. It's the task of leaders. We'll do surveys. Do you think life will be better for the next generation? Nobody in the ancient world would have asked that question. Most cultures thought of existence in terms of cycles, just an endless repetition of ups and downs. Events were dated by rulers, year 1 of the reign of Augustus and so on. But over time, the power of every Caesar and their grip on the human imagination faded, while another vision grew more compelling. By the 6th century, a Scythian monk proposed a new calendar that was based not on the founding of Rome, but on the birth of Jesus. And the creation of the calendar was not just a chronological convenience, it was a claim. It was an idea that life is not a random cycle, that it has a meaning, that it's leading somewhere, and that its critical event is the life of this Jewish carpenter. Jesus lived and died, and Caesar never heard a hint of his existence. But Jesus was called by his disciple John the Lord of Lords and the King of Kings. You'll understand that's not just a poetic phrase. The idea is, take all the kings, all the leaders that have ever been around, put them in a group. Jesus is the king over them. He's not just a king. He's not even the greatest king. He's the King of Kings. He's the Lord of Lords. Now, in the first century, while he had only a small group of followers, such a claim seemed laughable. And maybe it still does to you. I understand that. But I'll tell you one thing. If you were around back then and you had to bet on whose influence would last longer, Jesus or the Roman Empire, you would not put your money on the carpenter and his motley crew. And yet today, 2,000 years later, we give our children names like Peter, Paul, and Mary, and we give our dogs names like Caesar and Nero. 2,000 years after this man's birth, every time any human being anywhere on the planet looks at a date, we are reminded daily that Jesus Christ has become, in fact, the hinge of history, that Nero died in the year of our Lord 68, that Napoleon died in the year of our Lord 1828, that the dictator Joseph Stalin died in the year of our Lord 1953. Maybe Jesus was not the Lord of Lords and the King of Kings, but how strange is it that now every ruler who ever reigned, every nation that rises and falls must be dated in reference to the life of Jesus. Who was this man?